You know, there's this common misconception that silence is the sign of weakness. That if you don't speak, don't react, don't defend yourself, you've somehow surrendered. That you've let the other person win. But let me suggest to you something radically different. Silence, when used consciously and deliberately, is not weakness at all. It's power. It's a strategy. It's the refusal to let your soul be dragged into chaos, because here's the psychological reality. Narcissists thrive on reaction. Their world is built around provoking you, baiting you, controlling your inner state through relentless manipulation. They test your boundaries not because they want to understand you, but because they want to break you down into something more useful, more pliable, more compliant. And the easiest way for them to do that is through your emotions. The more you feel, the more they feed. And the more you express, the more they exploit. That's why silence is so effective. Because silence is not about disengagement in the passive sense. It's about reclaiming your agency. It's about refusing to be governed by their narrative. It says, I no longer accept the premise of this manipulation. That's what unnerves them. Not that you walked away, but that you didn't need to say anything when you did. When you stop reacting, something profound happens. You change the entire dynamic. You shift from being the puppet to becoming the observer. And that distance, that mental and emotional separation, is what gives you clarity. You stop playing the role they've assigned you. You're no longer the scapegoat, the caretaker, the emotional punching bag. You become something they can't categorize. And that ambiguity, that's what terrifies them. Because they can't control what they can't define. Think about it. When you respond with silence, you force them into a confrontation they've avoided their whole life, the confrontation with themselves. You strip away their ability to distort reality through your reactions. They can't spin your words if you don't speak. They can't misinterpret your tone if you don't give them one. They can't accuse you of rage if you remain calm. In silence, they are left alone with their own projection. And that, psychologically speaking, is a deeply destabilizing experience for someone who's built their entire identity around external validation and control. And here's another layer. Silence disrupts the feedback loop. See, narcissists regulate their fragile egos by using others as emotional regulators. They stir you up, and your emotional response becomes their dopamine hit. It reassures them that they still have power. It validates their distorted sense of superiority. But when you stop feeding that loop, when you go quiet, you effectively starve the mechanism. You're no longer providing them with the emotional fuel they depend on, and that starves the illusion they've built about themselves. They'll often interpret your silence as arrogance or cruelty. They'll project their own internal shame onto you. You're selfish. You don't care. You've changed. Yes, you have changed, but not in the way they claim. You've evolved. You've stopped needing to explain your worth. You've stopped trying to earn dignity from someone who never offered it sincerely in the first place. Now let's get one thing straight. This kind of silence doesn't mean you avoid the truth. It doesn't mean you never speak up for yourself. It means that you become selective, strategic. You don't waste your words on people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't argue with a person whose only goal is to win, not to understand. You preserve your breath for people who can actually hear you. That's wisdom. That's strength. There's a philosophical dimension to this too. Silence aligns you with a deeper kind of order. It roots you in presence. You start to see how much noise in your life has come from trying to fix or manage someone else's chaos. And when you fall into silence, true, centered silence, you begin to feel the weight of your own mind, your own presence. That's when you start living authentically again, not reacting, not defending, just being. And that's where your power lies. In the choice to disengage from insanity without needing to justify your exit. In the maturity to let the narcissist unravel on their own, without needing to narrate their fall, in the ability to recognize that not every battle deserves your energy, and not every accusation requires an answer. Because silence, real silence, is full of meaning. It is the statement that you are no longer available for the emotional warfare, that you are reclaiming your peace, your focus, your clarity, and most of all, your dignity. So when they scream for a reaction, when they poke and prod and provoke, when they attempt to shame you for your stillness, remember this: the one who stays silent in the face of chaos is the one who holds the most power. Your silence is not the absence of strength, it is the evidence of it. Speak only when it's worth it. The rest, let your silence roar. You need to understand something crucial about narcissists, something most people overlook because on the surface it seems counterintuitive. The narcissist doesn't fear confrontation. In fact, they feed on it. They feed on emotional chaos, especially yours. It gives them a sense of power, of control, of relevance. Your reactivity, your anger, your tears, your desperation becomes their validation. Because if you're that disturbed by their actions, then in their twisted internal logic, they must still matter. They're still significant. They still have emotional leverage. So the most dangerous thing you can do, the most threatening, most disarming thing, is to feel absolutely nothing. Not rage, not panic, not even righteous indignation. Just stillness, clarity, calm. It's not the cold withdrawal of someone who no longer cares. It's the principled choice of someone who refuses to be manipulated any longer. It's someone who has come to understand the architecture of psychological warfare and decided not to play the game. Now, this isn't easy. Emotional detachment isn't some quick fix tactic. It's not an act of denial or repression. It's an act of conscious discipline. It's developed through the painful process of waking up to the reality of what narcissistic abuse actually is. It's not love gone wrong. It's not a relationship with communication issues. It's psychological exploitation dressed up as connection. And once you see it for what it is, you can no longer unsee it. That's when the detachment begins, not as an act of vengeance, but as a necessary boundary to protect what's left of your sanity. And this is where silence becomes more than avoidance. It becomes a philosophical stance, a declaration of independence from the emotional tyranny you've been subjected to. Because narcissists don't just want your attention, they want your emotional dependence. They want your nervous system to orbit around them. That's the real hook. Not just that you love them, but that they become the central reference point for your inner life. And when you detach, when you no longer allow their words, moods, and manipulation to dominate your state of mind, you strip them of the very thing they need most: psychological control. There's a term for this in clinical psychology: emotional enmeshment. It's when the narcissist conditions you to internalize their approval as the only source of your stability. They groom you to feel anxious without their validation and guilty in the presence of your own needs. Over time, this makes you hyper-reactive because your self-worth starts depending on their unpredictable behavior. And that's exactly where they want you: on edge, unsettled, apologetic, always explaining, always hoping, always trying harder. But detachment destroys that system from the inside out. It's the refusal to explain yourself to someone who distorts your words. It's the decision to stop apologizing to someone who's never once taken accountability for their cruelty. It's the spiritual and psychological maturation into a person who no longer needs to convince someone of your worth. You know it already, and that knowledge quiets the noise. See, narcissists can handle almost anything, but not your peace. Your peace is their greatest threat. It's like a mirror they can't look into, because your calm makes their chaos visible. When you're no longer entangled in their emotional mess, you start to see it clearly. And worse, so do they, even if they never admit it consciously. Your detachment forces a contrast. It highlights the instability they can't hide. And since narcissists thrive on illusion, your refusal to engage breaks the spell. Now, they'll do everything they can to pull you back in. The love bombing, the guilt trips, the gaslighting, they're all designed to reactivate the bond. Because they don't miss you as a person. They miss what they could extract from you. And when you stop giving it, they panic, not because they love you, but because they're losing access to your emotional labor. That's why you must stay grounded. You must understand that your detachment is not cruelty, it's clarity. It's not abandonment, it's alignment. You are not punishing them by stepping away. You are saving yourself. And this brings us to the philosophical core of the matter. Emotional detachment isn't about becoming numb. It's about becoming sovereign. It's about making your internal world yours again, free from the distortions of someone else's brokenness. And that's not just personal healing. That's a form of rebellion. It's psychological and even spiritual warfare against a system of control that masquerades as love. So if you feel guilty for your silence, if you're doubting your emotional distance, let me remind you, your detachment is not a failure of empathy. It's the highest expression of wisdom, because true empathy includes you too, your pain, your boundaries, your dignity. And you don't owe your peace to someone who thrives on disturbing it. One of the most revealing and unsettling things that happens when you go silent with a narcissist is this. The mask starts to slip, slowly at first, subtly, but then with increasing desperation. And if you've ever witnessed it, you know exactly what I mean. It's that moment when the carefully constructed persona begins to crack under the weight of being ignored. Because narcissism is not simply a disorder of grandiosity. It's a disorder of performance. It is a life constructed around the avoidance of shame, wrapped in a facade of superiority, and powered entirely by external validation. And silence, it threatens that entire ecosystem. Now, this is where it gets psychologically fascinating and dangerous. When you're no longer participating in the narcissist's performance, when you withdraw your attention, your emotion, your validation, they're forced to face something they've spent their entire lives avoiding: themselves, their emptiness, their inadequacy, their unbearable sense of being insignificant. These are not mild discomforts for them. These are existential threats. You have to understand that. That's what makes your silence so powerful and so dangerous to their fragile self-immunement. The narcissist survives by constantly managing perceptions. Yours, theirs, the public's. They need to be seen a certain way, admired, feared, envied. If that image crumbles, even momentarily, it feels like psychological annihilation to them. So when you stop feeding the illusion, when you stop responding, reacting, affirming, you leave them alone with the very parts of themselves they've spent decades disowning. And without the constant reinforcement from your emotional responses, the mask starts to disintegrate. And it's not just that they feel exposed, it's that in their eyes you become dangerous. Because your silence doesn't just withdraw attention, it exerts power. And power, when it isn't under their control, is interpreted as a threat. So they'll begin to unravel. You'll see impulsivity spike. You'll see rage that feels disproportionate. You'll see desperate attempts to draw you back in through guilt, shame, flattery, even sudden vulnerability. It's not real vulnerability, of course. It's strategy. It's an attempt to regain control over the narrative, to pull you back into the emotional dance where they know all the steps and you forget who's leading. And that's what you must resist. Because the moment you engage again, not from clarity, but from emotional reactivity, you reset the cycle, and they rebuild the mask. Stronger this time, more convincing. And next time, it'll be harder to walk away. So let's be very clear. Your silence is not a passive thing. It's an active force. It disturbs the narcissist's sense of control because it forces the internal reality to surface. And when they can't perform their way out of it, they often collapse. Not outwardly, not always in some dramatic public breakdown, but internally. The machinery that kept the mask intact begins to corrode. You may witness this in small ways at first. Sarcasm where there used to be charm, coldness where there used to be seduction, incoherent rage that seems disproportionate to the situation. These are all signs that the mask is slipping. And it's slipping because they no longer have you as a co-star in their psychological theater. And let's not underestimate what a co-star really means in this context. You weren't just a partner. You were the emotional scaffolding that held up their entire sense of self. You were the mirror that gave them identity. When that mirror goes blank, when it stops reflecting the image they want to see, they lose orientation. It's like looking into a mirror that suddenly shows your real face after years of projection. And for someone with a narcissistic structure, that's intolerable. Now here's the part that's difficult, but vital. To accept. When the mask slips, you may feel sorry for them. You may see the scared, insecure person underneath, the child who was once neglected or hurt. And while that may be true, compassion must be balanced with discernment. Because vulnerability does not excuse abuse. And your empathy should never be weaponized against your own well-being. You are not responsible for holding someone else's mask in place so they don't fall apart. That's not love, that's captivity. What you are responsible for is yourself, your truth, your clarity, your peace. And ironically, it's only when you stop trying to manage the narcissist's emotional world that you can begin to truly manage your own. That's the shift. That's the awakening. It's the moment you stop being a character in their story and become the author of your own. So the next time you're tempted to break your silence just to soothe the discomfort of watching them unravel, remember this. The unraveling is not your fault. It's the natural consequence of a false self no longer being propped up by someone else's energy. Let it happen. Let the mask fall. It was never your job to hold it up in the first place. One of the most paradoxical truths about narcissistic abuse is this: the less you say, the more you see. Silence doesn't just disarm the narcissist, it reveals them. It strips away the performance, the charm, the justifications, the illusions. And what you're left with is something far more unsettling, but far more honest. You're left with reality. And that's exactly what most victims of narcissistic abuse have been denied: reality. Because every interaction with the narcissist is a distortion, a manipulation, a reframing of events to protect their ego and keep you confused. But the moment you go quiet, the fog starts to lift. This isn't just poetic language, it's psychological fact. Narcissists create environments of cognitive dissonance. They manufacture a kind of psychological instability that keeps you constantly second-guessing yourself. They shift blame. They rewrite history. They tell you that things didn't happen the way you remember them. And over time, if you're not grounded in something deeper, your values, your sense of truth, your memory, you start to lose touch with reality itself. That's not an accident. That's the plan. But silence disrupts that machinery. It halts the back and forth. It stops the narcissist from using your reactions as data points. It subjugates, because every word you speak, every clarification you offer, every emotional response you give, they're collecting it, they're analyzing it, they're finding ways to use it against you later. And when you go silent, you remove their access to that data. You stop feeding the algorithm of manipulation. But something else happens too. Something more important. You begin to see the game from a distance. You begin to notice patterns. You begin to recognize the subtle traps, the baiting, the triangulation, the way they twist your words and weaponize your empathy. And because you're no longer reacting in real time, you can think, you can reflect, you can observe. And in that observation lies power. Silence is a tool of observation. It's how you reclaim your perception. And once you can see the narcissist clearly, not as who they pretend to be, but as who they actually are, you stop personalizing their behavior. You stop thinking, what did I do to deserve this? And start thinking, why did I ever think I had to tolerate this? That's a radical shift. It's a philosophical reorientation. Because the whole narcissistic structure is designed to invert your focus, turns your gaze inward, makes you pathologize your own pain, makes you think that your suffering is the result of some flaw in you. But silence reverses that polarity. It turns the gaze outward, and it exposes the source of the dysfunction. This is why narcissists hate your silence. It's not just the lack of attention. It's the threat of being seen, truly seen, without filters, without the mask. Because when you're no longer distracted by defending yourself, when you're no longer trapped in endless circular conversations, you begin to see the architecture of the abuse. You see the pattern of escalation followed by feigned remorse. You see the cycles of idealization, devaluation, and discard. You see how they never really listen to you, only wait to react. And most importantly, you see how much you were manipulated into thinking this was normal. And once you see that, once you recognize the structure, you can no longer unknow it. That's the gift of silence. It's not passive, it's active awakening. It's the practice of stepping out of emotional warfare and into clarity. Now that clarity can be painful. Let's not romanticize it. Because seeing the truth about someone you loved or still love is shattering. You realize that the relationship wasn't what you thought it was. And so you realize that the relationship wasn't what you thought it was. And then you realize that the relationship wasn't what you thought it was. That things are not what you thought it was. You realize that the relationship wasn't what you thought it was. That some things isn't what you thought it was. And that it's not what you ever wanted it to be. That the intimacy you felt was one-sided. That the apologies were tactics. That the connection you cherished was being used to harm you. That realization can break you, but it's also the beginning of freedom. Because you can't leave what you can't see. You can't heal what you haven't named. You can't change what you haven't understood. And silence gives you the space to understand, to grieve, to remember who you were before the gaslighting, before the constant doubt, before your voice was drowned out by someone else's pathology. So if you find yourself in that space right now, in the quiet, in the stillness, in the aftermath of detaching, know this. What you're seeing now is not weakness, is not failure. It's truth. And truth, even when it's painful, is sacred. It's what orients us. It's what rescues us from illusion. It's what makes healing possible. And when the narcissist tries to bait you back in with rage or guilt or sudden warmth, remember what you've seen in the silence. Remember who they became when they could no longer manipulate your reactions. That's not an accident. That's who they are when the performance ends. And now you know. There's something deeply unsettling and revealing about what happens when you finally go silent in the presence of a narcissist. When you stop defending, stop explaining, stop trying to salvage the conversation. You begin to witness something raw. Their charm begins to fracture. The mask slips. You see, narcissists are not used to silence. They don't know how to interpret it. They can't tolerate it. They stop telling the truth. They start telling an acceptable lie. They can't fight it. They can't tolerate, because for them, silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's the absence of control. And when they lose control, their worst traits rise to the surface. This isn't a theory. It's a psychological reality. Silence strips the narcissist of their performance space. It removes the mirrors they depend on to reflect their own inflated image. If they're not being admired, validated, feared, or chased, they're left with nothing. No stage, no audience. And what you begin to see is what lies beneath the persona: rage, insecurity, paranoia, desperation. That's what silence reveals. Not because you attacked them, but because you didn't. You took away the oxygen they need, your attention. And it's in that moment, when the performance begins to fail, that you get your clearest look at who they really are. Narcissists don't break down into vulnerability in any meaningful way. When you expose the truth, they don't humbly reflect, they unravel. Not into humility, but into accusation, into projection, into attempts to punish you for daring to withhold what they believe they're entitled to: your energy, your validation, your emotional labor. You need to understand this. Narcissists interpret silence not as distance, but as betrayal. Because to them, your existence is supposed to revolve around their emotional demands. You are supposed to be available when they're angry, receptive when they're charming, responsive when they're spiraling. You are not supposed to have your own center, your own sense of timing, your own internal compass. And so, when you stop responding, it isn't neutral to them, it's mutiny. That's when they start flailing. Some will lash out with rage, saying things so cruel you wonder if they were always hiding beneath the surface. Others will flip the script, playing the victim so convincingly that you start to doubt yourself again. Still others will do both: rage, then remorse, then rage again, cycling through strategies in a desperate attempt to draw you back into their narrative. And this is where your silence becomes more than a tactic. It becomes a test of your psychological strength. Because let's be honest, it's not easy to stay silent when you're being attacked or guilt-tripped or love-bombed. It's not easy to hold the line when everything in you wants to clarify or defend or correct the record, especially if you're an empathetic person. Especially if you've spent years being conditioned to respond, to soothe, to manage, to fix. But that's exactly why this moment is so important. Because when the narcissist unravels, when their performance collapses, and the true face emerges, you have a choice. You can get pulled back into the drama, or you can stay grounded in the truth you've come to see. And that truth is this: their rage isn't about you. Their victimhood isn't about you. Their spiral isn't about you. It's about the vacuum your silence created. A vacuum where they're forced to confront the hollowness they've spent a lifetime avoiding. And that confrontation terrifies them. Now, some people hear this and say, isn't that cruel? Isn't it unkind to let someone spiral without reaching out, without responding? But that question misunderstands the entire dynamic. You're not punishing them. You're not playing games. You're removing yourself from an abusive pattern. You're choosing not to participate in a delusion where your only worth is in how well you serve someone else's dysfunction. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. The narcissist's unraveling is not a tragedy, it's a consequence. A consequence of finally encountering a boundary that doesn't bend, a silence that doesn't beg, a person who no longer plays the role they wrote for you. And that's when the power dynamic truly shifts. Because narcissists only hold power when you give it to them. Their dominance is never rooted in true strength, it's rooted in your confusion, your emotional dependence, your unhealed wounds. And when you stop responding, you signal that something fundamental has changed. You no longer need their approval to feel valid. You no longer need their version of the story to make sense of your reality. This is where healing begins. Not with some dramatic confrontation or final speech, but with the simple, consistent practice of disengaging, of no longer explaining your boundaries, of no longer negotiating your worth, of letting the narcissist spiral while you stay still, not because you're cold, but because you finally found your center. And from that center, you gain something that was missing all along: perspective. You begin to see how deeply the narcissist depended on your participation to maintain their illusion. You begin to realize that the collapse you're witnessing isn't your fault. It's the inevitable result of a false structure meeting immovable truth. And you, standing in silence, are that truth.